Great. Thank you, Professor Lowe. Hello to everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'll jump right in. I'll preface my comments, my presentation by saying that this is less a presentation of original research rather than a kind of a thought piece on the topic of the conference as a whole. Even as environmental initiatives attempt to ameliorate the effects of human activity on the natural environment, those same initiatives often add yet another layer to this human-non-human interface, with the potential to transform environmental conditions in complex and unexpected ways. Although environmental activism focuses on the complex ways in which human activity has altered and disrupted natural ecosystems, another important part of this equation involves the similarly complex socio-political ecosystems out of which these environmental initiatives emerge in the first place. In contemporary China, for instance, the state's Ecological Civilization campaign represents one of many governmental attempts to use state power to advance a series of environmental objectives, while an array of non-state actors advance a set of parallel yet nominally separate agendas. The resulting matrix of interlocking political, economic, and ideological and cultural factors that shape the interrelationship between these assorted state and nominally non-state initiatives is as complex and interdependent as the environmental challenges that both sets of initiatives are trying to address in the first place. The conference organizers have specified that they would like to focus not on the Chinese state's current ecological civilization campaign, but rather on a parallel set of environmental initiatives driven by non-state actors. While useful, this specification raises the additional methodological question of how one might distinguish between state and non-state initiatives, or state and non-state actors. In reality, in China and in other contemporary regions, most environmental initiatives cannot be rigidly classified as either state or non-state. Instead, they are shaped by a complex interplay of state and non-state factors. In today's talk, I will propose that at a methodological level, it would be useful and even necessary to deploy an ecological approach to an understanding of the structure and function of environmental initiatives in contemporary China. That is to say, environmental initiatives do not operate within autonomous and clearly demarcated categories, but rather they are positioned within an ecological system where they are shaped by a complex interplay of interrelated forces. Just as, to be effective, environmental initiatives must be grounded on an understanding of the balance of intersecting forces that structure any ecological system, any productive examination of those same environmental initiatives then itself must similarly be attentive to the ways in which those initiatives derive out of and are in turn shaped by a diverse array of socio-political and economic forces. To understand the socio-political ecosystem within which contemporary Chinese environmental initiatives operate, accordingly, it would be useful to focus on three overlapping matrices involving state and non-state factors, economic and non-economic factors, and domestic and foreign factors, respectively. So my proposal is to use a kind of an ecological approach to think of China's environmental sort of actions and policies and the way in which they revolve around these three different sets of binarized matrices: state and non-state, economic and non-economic, and domestic and foreign, respectively. So first, the state non-state matrix is the one that the conference organizers have foregrounded most explicitly, proposing a conceptual opposition between state-driven initiatives such as the current Ecological Civilization campaign on one hand, and a wide array of parallel initiatives that are associated with non-state actors on the other. While this opposition is certainly productive as a starting point, however, it is equally important to recognize that the many ways in which state and non-state elements are symbiotically intertwined with one another. For instance, in English, the standard term for a non-state actor is an NGO, a non-governmental organization. And as Dan Gutman, Yi Jiajing, and Oran Young note in their 2021 book, Non-State Actors in China and Global Environmental Governance, so a book that they published on this topic last year, by the end of 2019, there were more than 860,000 organizations that China's English language party paper, the China Daily, described as NGOs. So the way that China itself described these organizations as NGOs, non-governmental organizations, in its own English language publication. which included organizations that were categorized in several different ways in Chinese, such as nonprofit enterprises, 民办非企业单位, which in 2015 were then recategorized as social service organizations, shehui fuwu jigou, as well as social groups, shehui tuanti, and foundations, jijinhui. Although all of these organizations are officially recognized as being non-state actors, i.e. what in English we call NGOs, they must nevertheless all secure government approval and be assigned a supervisory agency run by the state. The result is that in classic Foucauldian fashion, there's actually relatively little in contemporary China that is truly outside of state influence. And even nominally non-state actors generally need to be authorized and even supervised by the state. Gutman, Jing, and Yong do observe that in addition to these nearly 1 million organizations that the Chinese state recognizes being non-state actors, other organizations that cannot obtain official registration from the state sometimes register as simply as companies, 公司, or even go without formal legal status altogether. But it is likely that even with the latter subset of organizations, the shadow of state influence continues to loom large. Overlapping with this state non-state matrix, meanwhile, is a separate but interrelated matrix of economic and non-economic factors. On one hand, environmental concerns are clearly intertwined with a wide array of economic factors. Major economic sectors such as energy, agriculture, and construction industries have an enormous impact on environmental conditions, even as they are themselves simultaneously vulnerable to current and future environmental changes. Agents representing those sectors, accordingly, are frequently motivated to keep key elements of those sectors in place in order to preserve the value of earlier investments and to help guarantee future revenue streams, even as they may be simultaneously motivated to help transform those same sectors for a combination of economic, ethical, and environmental reasons. For instance, even as China has strategically positioned itself as one of the world's leading investors in renewable energy sources such as wind and solar, it nevertheless remains highly reliant on fossil fuels. In recent years, its coal production has continued to increase, a phenomenon driven by a combination of economic considerations, that energy from coal burning is relatively cheap, as well as policy considerations. Coal is an important piece of the government's broader attempt to maintain energy security and energy independence. Agents involved with energy production in China, accordingly, frequently must balance a set of environmental considerations, including the impact that different energy sources may have on air, water, and soil pollution, with corresponding economic considerations, including the current and anticipated future costs of different forms of energy production, as well as a complicated set of political and ideological considerations, including not only the state's objective of securing energy independence, but also its awareness of the ideological, diplomatic, and economic advantages of promoting green energy. On the other hand, discussions of environmental concerns frequently make a point of foregrounding a set of ethical considerations that theoretically transcend and may even appear to be in direct conflict with a set of more narrow economic or political considerations. The idea that humans are stewards of the environment and should make choices based on an attempt to minimize their negative impacts on natural ecosystems is a powerful one. And this attitude is increasingly a factor in many policy and business discussions. China, like many nations, is increasingly aware of the soft power advantages of positioning itself as a global leader in environmental issues, even when it comes to taking positions that, at least in the short term, might appear to run counter to its more immediate economic objectives. Of course, this distinction between economic and non-economic factors is itself very blurred. Actions that may appear to run counter to economic priorities if one focuses only on the present or the immediate future could in fact prove to be immensely profitable in the long run, and vice versa. Also, in the current ideological climate, agents, be they individuals, corporations, or even nations, can derive considerable influence and even material benefit by advocating for environmentally progressive objectives, even if their actions don't necessarily accord with their public stances. Finally, overlapping with the preceding state, non-state, and economic, non-economic matrices, is a third matrix consisting of an interplay of domestic and foreign factors. In contemporary China, domestically driven initiatives, sponsored either by the state or by nominally non-state actors, are in complex interrelationship with a diverse array of foreign-driven initiatives, including ones associated with foreign NGOs, corporations, governments, and even nominally autonomous groups such as foreign tourists. Although the Chinese state maintains a considerable influence over domestic socioeconomic policy, foreign agents can also have a tangible effect on the direction that this policy may take. For instance, foreign NGOs are permitted to operate in China, and they frequently work to calibrate their objectives within China with the global agenda. Similarly, many global corporations, including joint ventures as well as global corporations whose owners directors are based outside of China, can have a far-reaching influence on China's society, economy, and environment. Also, foreign visitors, including tourists, students, and foreign residents, represent a not insignificant force in contemporary China. For instance, in 2019, the last year before the pandemic, nearly 150 million international tourists visited China and spent over $40 billion. And while $40 billion may only represent a tiny fraction of China's overall GDP, it is large enough to amount to be significant in some sectors. At the same time, just as with state, non-state, and economic, non-economic binaries, the domestic-foreign binary is blurred and overdetermined. For instance, although foreign corporations, NGOs, and so forth are by definition associated with international organizations, they must nevertheless obtain official government approval to operate in China. And the need to maintain this approval may often influence the NGOs or other associations' decisions and actions. The incentive to maintain government approval, meanwhile, may influence the actions of those corporations and NGOs in ways that may not always be visible to the wider public. A good example of the relationship between these three overlapping sets of binarized matrices can be observed in some of the current debates over Elon Musk's proposal to purchase and privatize Twitter. As is well known, most of Musk's wealth is derived from his work with Tesla, which in turn is one of the most visible and influential players in the electric car industry and related areas. And while Tesla is a global company with headquarters located in the United States, a key node in the company's global production network is the factory that it opened in Shanghai in 2019. By last year, 2021, the factory, Tesla Giga Shanghai, was already producing nearly 500,000 vehicles. Nearly 1 million vehicles, amounting to approximately half of the company's global production and 7% of the world's entire electric vehicle production, with approximately 1/3 of those vehicles being sold within China itself, thereby making China the company's second largest market after the US. The factory was constructed with strong incentives from China's national and local governments. And while the factory's success is clearly beneficial to China, it's also true that Tesla is similarly motivated to maintain a positive relationship with the Chinese government in order to maximize the factory's future prospects. Given that road transportation is the single largest sector in global oil consumption, in 2020, for instance, road transportation accounted for over 48% of total oil consumption among the 38 OECD nations. And while China is not a member of OECD, there's no obvious reason to think that its oil consumption patterns would differ significantly from those nations. Electric vehicles will almost inevitably play a key role in any successful effort to lower global fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions. Of course, for the shift to electric vehicles to be maximally effective in reducing carbon emissions, the electrical grid needs to decrease or eliminate its own reliance on fossil fuels, but that's a different story. The outsized position of Tesla within the electric vehicle industry, combined with Tesla's own outsized reliance on its Shanghai factory, not to mention the array of other China-based factories from which it sources its parts, as well as the growing importance of the Chinese market for electrical vehicles, means that China, by extension, has become a key player in the renewable energy ecosystem simply by virtue of its potential influence over Tesla, not to mention the wide array of other areas where China is moving aggressively on issues relating to renewable energy. It is therefore not surprising that the electric vehicle industry is one area where state and non-state, economic and non-economic, domestic and foreign considerations intersect in complex ways. Many governments, including China's, have enacted a variety of measures to encourage the manufacture and sale of electric vehicles, though these measures are often in concert with efforts of non-governmental environmental organizations. Similarly, the electric vehicle industry is currently an immensely profitable growth sector, which has helped to propel Tesla to a market valuation over $900 billion, making it the sixth most valuable company in the world. Though a significant portion of that growth and current valuation is due not to the company's current profitability, but rather to expectations about how the company's global position will intersect with a set of non-economic discourses and trends. For instance, Tesla's reported $3.3 billion in profits in the first quarter of this year, which was significantly higher than predicted, was still less than a tenth of the profits that a company like Apple, with a $3 trillion valuation, reported for the same period. Which is to say that proportionally Tesla's valuation is much higher than its relative profitability at the present moment. Finally, although Tesla is based in the US and has a global footprint, its production and sales within China are inevitably subject to government influence, both positively and negatively. So to conclude, as many commentators have observed, Elon Musk's prospective purchase of Twitter means that the intersecting set of state and non-state, economic and non-economic, domestic and foreign factors that combine to influence Tesla's current and future development, both within China and globally, may also have a direct impact on the current and future development of Twitter itself. If Musk does succeed in purchasing and privatizing Twitter, accordingly, his control over Twitter, and particularly its policies on speech moderation, may end up being subject to Chinese influence. And while it is true that Twitter is banned in China, is nevertheless the platform is nevertheless widely acknowledged that the platform is used by voices associated with the Chinese government to help promote Chinese state agendas and ideologies abroad. This being the case, it's noteworthy and certainly ironic that China's notable investment in renewable energy, via its collaboration with Tesla, among many other initiatives, could end up influencing its ability to impact Twitter's own discursive and ideological ecosystem in ways that could ultimately undermine ideologically and environmentally progressive agendas around the world. So that's my talk. Thank you.